Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the Autobiography. Chapter 1. Three Virgins at Business. 1967-1970. At the end of the summer term, 1967, Johnny Gems and I moved into the basement of his parents' house in Connaught Square, just off the Edgware Road in London. We managed to persuade Vanessa Redgrave to change her mind from merely sending us her best wishes for the success of Student to giving us an interview. The interview was a turning point for us, since we could now use her name as a magnet to attract other contributors. As the list of contributors grew to include people like David Hockney and Jean-Paul Sartre, it became correspondingly easier for me to persuade some of the possible advertisers that Student would be a worthwhile place for them to appear. Johnny and I lived in the basement all summer. The room was dark, dank, and sparsely furnished. We slept on mattresses on the floor. The place quickly began to look a complete shambles, scattered with papers, dirty coffee cups, and fish and chip wrappers. We were always hungry. Sometimes we would slip upstairs to raid Johnny's parents' fridge. Mum would occasionally burst in through the door carrying a picnic hamper. "Red Cross delivery," she would shout. "When did you two last wash?" We would spread a counterpane on the floor and pile into her picnic. One day she brought us £100 in cash. Mum had found a necklace on the road near Shamley Green and taken it into the police station. When nobody had claimed it after 3 months, the police told her she could have it. She knew we had no money, so she came up to London, sold it, and gave us the money. Her £100 paid off our telephone and postage bills and kept us going for months. Without it, we could have collapsed. Peter Blake, who was famous for designing the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album cover, drew a picture of a student for our first edition. It was a plain white cover with only 2 splashes of red on the title, Student, and the red tie the student wore. As well as giving us this illustration, Peter Blake also gave us an interview. He began in arresting style. "A very pretty girl with no clothes on is a marvelous subject, and one I'm particularly interested in. It is one of those things, along with perspective and anatomy, which teaches you how to draw." While I rapidly considered the advantages of becoming an artist, he went on to point out the dangers of student power, which struck a controversial note at the time. "I don't think the students should have any more power over the teachers than they have already. Just at the moment, I don't really like students as a group of people. I think they rather overrate themselves. They seem to talk a lot and protest a lot, and have too many rights. I think one could get over-involved in the activity of being a student. After all, students are not so important. They are really only there to learn how to be adults. Students shouldn't feel that they have to complain." Perhaps because we were so young and not as aggressive as the usual professional interviewers they faced, some of our contributors made very revealing and graphic remarks. Gerald Scarfe described his work. "I'll always draw. It's a matter of energy. I could never stop. It's as much a part of me as eating. When I get an idea, it has to come out. It is like being sick, a bodily function." When I asked Dudley Moore what he thought of students, he answered, "The only thing I hate about your generation is your age." He had been an organ scholar at Magdalen College, Oxford, but when I mentioned classical music, he said, "I'd much rather roll about in the mud with 6 women all day than sit down at the piano." Mick Jagger and John Lennon also agreed to be interviewed. Both were demigods to the student population. Student gave a grandiose introduction to the Jagger interview. Recently, Melody Maker wrote, "Jagger is rather like Dostoevsky's brother Karamazov, who, when told by his venerable brother that pain must exist, so that we might learn of goodness, replied that, if it was necessary that one small child should suffer in order that he should be made more aware, he did not deny the existence of God, but merely respectfully returned his ticket of admission to heaven. That is Mick Jagger's kind of rebellion. I can't imagine what we were thinking of when we quoted that. I certainly didn't understand it. I nervously went along to his house on Cheyne Walk, and was shown into the living room by Marian Faithfull, who then tantalizingly disappeared upstairs. Mick and I smiled at each other genially, but were both equally at a loss for words. RB, do you like giving interviews? MJ, no. RB, why did you ask student to interview you? MJ, I don't know. I've got no idea. I don't usually give interviews. I mean, hardly ever. RB, you're not interested in politics? MJ, no. RB, why not? MJ, because I've kind of thought about it for a long time and decided that I haven't got time to do that and understand other things. I mean, if you get involved in politics, you get really fucked up. RB, do you think people can be influenced by music? MJ, yeah, I think they probably can because it's one of those things. It's repetitive, the same thing over and over again. It gets into your brain and influences you. Our interview with John Lennon was another classic. Johnny and I went along together, and Johnny tried to make a literary allusion. JG, a critic has written about a day in the life as a kind of miniature wasteland. JL, miniature what? JG, T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland. JL, I don't know about that. Not very hip on me culture, you know. Ironically, the interview with John was almost the end of student. After Johnny and I had met him, I had the idea of asking whether John and Yoko would provide the magazine with an original recording which we could distribute with student as a flexidisc. I contacted Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer. At that time, the Beatles had just set up the Apple Foundation for the Arts, with the idea of funding struggling artists and musicians. Most of Derek's day was spent sitting in his office in Savile Row, interviewing a long procession of supplicants, all with 100 different reasons why they thought the Beatles should give them money. He was like a Lord Chamberlain at the court of the king. A sweet man, Derek would listen patiently to every request, no matter how far-fetched or nonsensical. When I told him what we wanted to do, Derek agreed without a moment's hesitation. John and Yoko would be delighted to provide something, he said. He introduced me to Ron Cass, the managing director of Apple, and to a manufacturer of flexidiscs, and we arranged a delivery date. I rushed back to Connaught Square with the good news. Not only did we have a John Lennon interview, we would soon have an original, unreleased John Lennon song. It was a fantastic promotional coup for student. We contacted Alan Aldridge, the most fashionable illustrator of the day, and commissioned him to design a special front cover, leaving a white space where the flexidisc would be attached. And we made plans to print 100,000 copies of the magazine, our largest ever print run. The weeks went by, and still no record arrived. In mounting anxiety, I called Derek. Don't worry, Richard, he said. We've had a few problems, but I promise you'll get something. In fact, I could hardly have chosen a worse time to tax the Lennons' goodwill. Yoko had just lost the baby she was expecting. John had been busted for possession of cannabis, and the couple were lying low at their mansion in Weybridge. I was in trouble myself. Our plans for the special issue had put student on the brink of bankruptcy. I was getting desperate. For the first time in my life, I contacted a lawyer, Charles Levison, who wrote to Derek, threatening to sue Apple and the Lennons for breach of promise. A few days later, I received a telephone call from Derek. Come round to Apple, Richard, he said. We've got something for you. That afternoon I sat in the basement studio at Apple, with Charles, Derek, John, and Yoko, listening to the recording they'd provided. The hiss of the tape recorder was followed by a steady metronomic beat, like the sound of a human heart. "What is it?" I asked. "It's the heartbeat of our baby," said John. No sooner had he spoken than the sound stopped. Yoko burst into floods of tears and hugged John. I didn't understand what was going on, but before I could speak, John looked over Yoko's shoulder straight into my eyes. "The baby died," he told me. "That's the silence of our dead baby." I went back to student with no idea what I should do. I felt unable to release this private moment as a record. Perhaps I was wrong because, as Derek said, it was conceptual art and would have become a collector's piece. We had to scrap the covers and redesign the magazine. It cost a lot of money, but somehow we managed to scrape it together. I considered taking legal action against the Lennons, but they'd had enough problems, and anyway, they'd honored the agreement in their own particular way, even if I couldn't see the value of it at the time. After our dispute over the recording, Derek wrote a note apologizing for all the trouble I'd been caused. His sign-off was a phrase he put on all his correspondence. "All you need is love." Johnny read extensively. I hardly read at all. I never seemed to have the time. I would spend the days on the telephone, trying to sell advertising space, persuading people to write for Student for nothing, or to be interviewed. Throughout my life, I've always needed somebody as a counterbalance, to compensate for my weaknesses and work off my strengths. Johnny and I were a good team. He knew who we should interview and why. I had the ability to persuade them to say yes, and the obstinacy never to accept no for an answer. In many of the interviews I conducted for Student, I just turned the tape recorder on and let the interviewee say whatever they wanted. Before meeting the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing, I had tried to read his bestseller, The Politics of Experience. Like most people, I suspect, I had understood hardly a word of it. I aimed the microphone at him, and he spoke without stopping for an hour and a half, staring at a corner of the ceiling behind my head. I had no idea what he was rabbiting on about. I was just grateful that there wasn't any room for me to ask him a single question. At the end, when it became apparent that he had finished, I thanked him profusely, went back to the office and transcribed it. It turned out that he had just quoted pages from The Politics of Experience, almost verbatim. After a few issues, the number of people involved with Student began to grow. Johnny and I would sometimes go to nightclubs and chat up girls. Sometimes we could even persuade them to come back to the flat for coffee. If they stayed the night, the next morning we would try to persuade them to help out. For some reason, they often seemed to take pity on us. Word of mouth spread. Old friends turned up from school, friends of friends, or people who had read the magazine, wanted to be involved. Increasingly, the basement resembled a squat. We all worked for no money, living off whatever was in the fridge, and going out for cheap curries. All sorts of people helped to distribute the magazine. The basic idea was that they would take away bundles of magazines and sell them for 2.60 a copy, and then come back and give us half the proceeds, 1.3d for each copy sold. They were meant to pay us in advance, but it rarely seemed to work like that. But I never really worried about how much profit Student made. I was just determined to have enough cash in the kitty to produce the next issue and pay our bills. I thought that the more copies we sold, the more word of mouth would spread, and ultimately the more advertising we would be able to attract. Although I hardly realized it at the time, my ambition to be a journalist was beginning to be pushed to one side by the imperatives of keeping the magazine afloat. Johnny ran the editorial side, while I ran the business and sold advertising space, and argued with the printers. I was becoming an entrepreneur almost by default, Although if anybody had mentioned the word to me, then I would probably have had to ask Johnny what it meant. I certainly didn't regard myself as a businessman. Businessmen were middle-aged men in the city obsessed with making money. They wore pinstripe suits and had wives and 2.4 children in the suburbs. Of course, we wanted to make money on student too. We needed money to survive. But we saw it much more as a creative enterprise than a money-making one. Later, it became apparent to me that business could be a creative enterprise in itself. If you publish a magazine, you're trying to create something that is original, that stands out from the crowd, that will last and hopefully serve some useful purpose. Above all, you want to create something you are proud of. That has always been my philosophy of business. I can honestly say that I have never gone into any business purely to make money. If that is the sole motive, then I believe you are better off not doing it. A business has to be involving. It has to be fun, and it has to exercise your creative instincts. Running Student was certainly fun. Each day unfolded to the deafening strains of Bob Dylan, the Beatles, or the Stones blaring out of the hi-fi system, shaking the walls of the basement. When Johnny and I went out to sell copies of the magazine, we would celebrate a single sale of the magazine for $2.60 by going and buying 2 hamburgers for $1.30 each. Every now and then I would look out of the grimy basement window and see that it was a beautiful day. I would turn off the music and tell everyone we had to go out for a walk. We would wander across Hyde Park, and then somehow someone would end up in the Serpentine, and we'd all have a swim. Tony Meller was one of the main assistant editors, and we all respected him because he had been a trade union official. Tony was rather older than the rest of us, and was extremely articulate about socialism. As everyone argued over the exact wording of some of the more political pronouncements in the magazine, I was beginning to be aware of a wider picture, the politics of survival. In some ways I became an outsider on the magazine. While the others would be talking about the LSD guru Timothy Leary, Pink Floyd, and the latest convolutions of student politics, I would be worrying about paying the printers and telephone bills, as well as spending time on the telephone trying to persuade leading figures of the day to write for Student, just for the love of it. I also had to spend hours calling up companies such as British Leland or Lloyd's Bank, trying to convince them to buy advertising space. Without their money, Student would collapse. The responsibility made me grow up fast. You might almost say that I was old before my time. While the others might happily sit around in the evening getting stoned, unconcerned about waking up late the next morning with a hangover, I was always aware of the need to keep a clear head. My parents and Lindy came up to help us sell copies of the magazine. Mum took a bundle to Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park and pushed them into the unsuspecting hands of tourists. Lindy and I walked up and down Oxford Street selling copies of Student to anybody we could stop. I was once with Lindy when a tramp came up and asked for money. We had no money. That's exactly what we were looking for too. But in a histrionic fit of idealism, I stripped off most of my clothes and gave them to him. I spent the rest of the day walking around in a blanket. Poor old tramp. Dad chuckled when he heard the story. That'll teach him. All he wanted was some loose change, and he got a set of infested clothes from you. Student began to attract a high profile, and one day a German television channel asked me whether I would make a speech at University College London, along with the activist Tariq Ali and the German student leader Danny Cohn-Bendit. The brief was to talk about people's rights. A vast crowd welcomed these 2 firebrand revolutionaries. I stood and listened as Danny Cohn-Bendit made a brilliant speech full of intellectual depth and passion. Everyone around him was cheering and roaring their approval. Then Tariq Ali stood up, and he too made a passionate speech. The crowd stamped and shouted at the tops of their voices, as if they were about to descend upon the Bastille. I began to feel a little queasy. At Stowe there had been a very cruel tradition. Each boy had to learn a long poem and stand up in front of the entire school and recite it. If you made the slightest mistake or paused for a moment, the master hit a gong, and you had to leave the stage accompanied by great boos and jeers all round. You were gonged off. Since I was mildly dyslexic, I found it extremely difficult to learn anything by heart, and for several years was gonged off with relentless regularity. As I watched Danny Cohn-Bendit and Tariq Ali making their inspiring speeches, surfing on the goodwill of the crowd, and milking the television camera for all it was worth, I felt the same sickening feeling in my stomach as I had felt when I was waiting to recite my Tennyson piece in the sure knowledge that I would be gonged off stage and loudly booed. Finally Tariq Ali finished his speech. There was pandemonium. Everyone cheered. Somebody hoisted him on their shoulders. Pretty girls waved admiringly up at him, and the camera swiveled in his direction. Then somebody beckoned to me. It was my turn. I hopped up to the podium and nervously took the microphone. I had barely spoken in public, let alone made a speech before, and I felt chronically nervous. I had absolutely no idea what to say. I had prepared a speech, but, under the scrutiny of 1,000 expectant faces turned towards me like sunflowers, my mind had gone completely blank. Dry-mouthed, I mumbled a few words, gave a sick smile, and realized with a mounting feeling of panic that I could not do it. There was nowhere to hide. I gave a final inarticulate mumble, somewhere between a cough and a vomit, dropped the microphone, leapt off the podium, and disappeared back into the safety of the crowd. It had been the most embarrassing moment of my life. Even now, whenever I am interviewed or have to give a speech, I feel the same trepidation, and I have to overcome the same sense of shyness. If I'm talking on a subject that I know a little about, or that I feel passionately about, then I can be reasonably fluent. But when I'm asked to talk about something I know very little about, I become extremely uncomfortable, and it shows. I have come to accept that I will never have all the smooth instant answers that a politician would have. I try not to fight my stutters or inability to leap to a perfect answer. Instead, I just try to give the truthful answer. And if it takes a little time to work out that answer, I hope that people will trust a slow, hesitant response more than a rapid, glib one. The wars in Vietnam and Biafra were the two leading issues of the late 1960s. If Student was to be a credible publication, we had to have our own reporters in both countries. We had no money to send any reporters out there, let alone pay for them to stay in hotels and telex back articles. So we had to think laterally. We finally came up with the idea that if we chose very young reporters, then they might be a story in themselves. So I called up the Daily Mirror and asked whether they would be interested in running an exclusive story about a 17-year-old reporter going to Vietnam. They bought the story and paid for Julian Magnon, who was working with us at Student, to go to Vietnam. Julian went there, filed some great articles about the Vietnam War, and subsequently went on to become a famous ITN reporter. We managed to make the same arrangement with sending a 16-year-old reporter to Biafra. These two ventures were my first experience of leveraging up the Student name. We put in the name and the people, and the other side put up the money to fund it. I felt very passionately about the campaign to end American involvement in Vietnam. In October 1968, all the Student staff joined Vanessa Redgrave on the Student March to Grosvenor Square to protest outside the American Embassy. I marched alongside Vanessa and Tariq Ali. It was tremendously exciting to be marching for something I believed in, along with tens of thousands of others. The mood of the crowd was exhilarating, but at the same time slightly frightening. You felt at any moment that things could get out of control. And they did. When the police charged the crowd, I ran like hell. A photograph of the demonstration later appeared in Paris Match. It shows me, back arched, an inch away from the outstretched hand of a policeman who was trying to catch me as I sprinted across the square. While I opposed Vietnam, I didn't feel as passionately left-wing on other issues as most of my fellow demonstrators. I suppose I am left-wing, I told a reporter from The Guardian. Well, only to the extent that I think left-wing views are sane and rational. Student was not a radical magazine in the political sense. Nor were we an underground magazine, like Oz and IT. We weren't advocating putting LSD in the water supply, as they might have done from time to time. Although I think there was just as much free love in our offices as there was in theirs. I tried to maintain a balance between the views of the left and the right. But what I hoped was balance some people saw as prevarication. The writer and poet Robert Graves wrote to me from Dia, Majorca, where he lived. Your hands seem tied tighter than students deserve. In the Biafra story, for instance, you don't once mention what the war is really about in the international context. But that is because you have to keep pals with the over-30s and the big business boys, or the journal couldn't survive. Yes, you do your best. In fact, the big business boys weren't being as friendly as I'd hoped. The struggle to secure advertising had always been much more difficult than finding contributors. We were pleased to be able to interview the actor Brian Forbes, or publish Gavin Maxwell's article. But they didn't bring in money to help us run the magazine and distribute it. We charged £250 for a whole-page advertisement, down to £40 for an eighth of a page. For example, after countless calls, I had managed to get 9 companies to take out full-page ads in the first edition. J. Walter Thompson Metal Box, The Sunday Times, The Daily Telegraph, The Gas Council, The Economist, Lloyd's Bank Rank Organization, and John Lang Builders. These 9 advertisements had brought in £2,250 and had been wrung out of a list that started off with over 300 possible companies. But it had been enough to cover the cost of printing the 30,000 copies of the first issue. With these funds, I had opened an account at Coutts, where my family had always banked, as our clearing bank. I must have been their only customer who walked in barefoot and asked for a £1,000 overdraft. Throughout the life of Student, selling advertising space was always an uphill struggle. For all our efforts, it was clear that Student wasn't making money. I began to think of ways to develop the magazine and the Student name. In other directions, a student conference, a student travel company, a student accommodation agency. I didn't just see Student as an end in itself, a noun. I saw it as the beginning of a whole range of services, an adjective, a word that people would recognize as having certain key values. In 1970s language, Student magazine, and everything Student promoted should be hip. Student was a flexible concept, and I wanted to explore this flexibility to see how far I could push it and where it would lead. In this way, I was a little removed from the rest of my friends, who concentrated exclusively on the magazine and the student politics they wanted to cover. It seems Peter Blake was right in saying that student revolution would go out of fashion, and students with it. However, looking at the early editions of Student 30 years later, I'm amazed by how little has changed. Student then had cartoons of Ted Heath by Nicholas Garland. He was still being caricatured right up until his death by Nicholas Garland. David Hockney, Dudley Moore and John Le Carre still make good copy, and Brian Forbes and Vanessa Redgrave, or at least their daughters, are still in the news. Life in the basement was the kind of all-embracing, glorious chaos in which I thrived and have thrived ever since. We never had any money, we were incredibly busy, But we were a close-knit team. We worked together because it was fun, because we felt that what we were doing was important, and because we had great lives together. Soon a number of journalists from the national papers came to interview me to see what all the buzz was about. We developed a foolproof way of impressing them. I sat at my desk, the telephone at my elbow. "Great to meet you. Take a seat," I would say, waving the journalist down into the beanbag opposite me. As they shuffled around trying to retain their dignity, get comfortable, and remove the drips of hummus and piles of cigarette ash from the folds, the telephone would ring. "Can someone take that, please?" I would ask. Now, I turned my attention to the journalist. "What do you want to know about student?" "It's Ted Heath for you, Richard," Tony would call across. "I'll call him back," I'd say over my shoulder. "Now, what did you want to know about student?" By this time the journalist was craning round to watch Tony tell Ted Heath that he was sorry, but Richard was in a meeting and he'd call him back. Then the telephone would ring again, and Tony would pick it up. "David Bailey for you, Richard." "I'll call him back, but will you ask if he can change that lunch date? I've got to be in Paris." "Okay." I'd flash an apologetic grin at the journalist. "Now, how are we doing?" "I just wanted to ask you." The telephone rang again. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Tony would apologize, "but it's Mick Jagger for you and he says it's urgent." "Please excuse me for a minute," I'd say, reluctantly picking up the phone. "Mick, hello." "Fine, thanks, and you? Really? An exclusive?" "Yes, that sounds great." And on I went until Johnny couldn't stop laughing in the call box opposite, or the pips went. "I'm sorry," I'd say to the journalist. "Something's cropped up and we've got to." "Are we finished?" The journalist would be ushered out in a daze, passing Johnny on the way, and the telephone would stop ringing. Journalists swallowed our scam hook, line, and sinker. Photographers, journalists, writers from papers throughout the world seemed to have fallen over themselves in assisting student, wrote the Sunday Telegraph. And a massive voluntary distribution organization has grown throughout schools and universities, allowing perhaps over 500,000 students to read the magazine. An amazing number of top-class contributors. "Its scope is limitless," said the Observer, while the Daily Telegraph said, "It seems probable that Student, the glossy publication that has attracted a lot of well-known writers, will become one of the largest circulated magazines in the country." By autumn 1968, Johnny's parents had understandably had enough of having almost 20 teenagers squatting in their basement, and asked us to find somewhere else to live. We moved to 44 Albion Street, just round the corner from Connaught Square. Johnny left to go back to school and take his A-levels. He felt guilty about abandoning me, but he was under pressure to continue his education, and his parents sensibly worried that working on a small magazine from their basement was hardly the perfect foundation on which to earn much of a living. Without Johnny, Student almost fell to pieces. There was too much for me to do, and nobody else whom I could really trust to help me out. After a few weeks, I asked Nick to come and help. Nick had finished at Ampleforth, but was due to go to Sussex University at Brighton. He agreed to delay going to university and come to Student's aid. With Nick's arrival, Student was put back on the rails. He started controlling the cash, and rather than having a large biscuit tin full of money, which anyone could dip into to buy food or drink or dope, Nick used our Coutts account properly. He started writing checks, and then checking the stubs off against the bank statements. Nick had lost a front tooth, and with his long black hair he looked rather terrifying. I think he kept away a lot of debt collectors. The commune, which had been very cramped in Johnny's basement, now spread up and down the new house. People made dens, and there were mattresses and joss sticks everywhere. By now most of the people working with student were 19 or 20, and there was lots of talk about free love, and lots of practice of it. I installed a large brass bed on the top floor, with a telephone running off a long extension lead which looped down through the banisters. Some days I did all my business from bed. I'd put the house in my parents' name so that the owners, the church commissioners, would not think we were running a business from it. My parents loved the excitement of journalism, and, although Dad was a barrister with short hair, who wore a blazer and tie to church on Sundays, he and Mum never had any problem talking to people who had hair halfway down their backs, and hadn't shaved or washed for a month. Lindy came to stay in Albion Street every half-term, and during some of her holidays. She helped distribute student, and fell in love with a series of men working on the magazine. I had a short relationship with Debbie, one of the girls living at Albion Street, and working on the magazine. One day she told me she was pregnant. We were both very shocked, and realized that a baby was the last thing we could cope with. Debbie decided that she wanted to have an abortion. After a few telephone calls it became clear that this would be very difficult to arrange. Debbie could not have an abortion on the National Health Service, unless she had proven psychiatric or medical problems. We grew frantic phoning around all the national health hospitals, trying to see if there was any way this could be overcome. When we tried to find a private doctor to help, we found it would cost over £400, money we didn't have. I was at my wits' end when I finally tracked down a kind doctor in Birmingham, who told me that she would arrange the operation for £50. After the operation, Debbie and I realized that there must be a host of young people who had faced the same problem, and had nowhere to turn for help. It would surely be much better if there were one telephone number you could ring to be referred to the right doctor. It wasn't just unwanted pregnancies that were the problem. What if you needed psychological help, or had a venereal disease, but were scared of admitting it to your nice family doctor, or had run away from home and had nowhere to live? We drew up a long list of the sorts of problems that students faced, and decided to do something about it. We would give out our telephone number, work out a list of all the best and most helpful doctors, and see who called. Give us your headaches was the slogan for the Student Advisory Center. We handed out leaflets along Oxford Street, and advertised in Student. Soon the calls started coming in. A number of doctors, both in the National Health Service and the private sector, agreed to give their services for free or a minimal charge. So we built up a network of professionals to whom we could refer people. Worries about pregnancy and contraception formed many of the calls, but we also became quite a center for gay men and lesbians to hang around. It soon became clear that they were not as interested in asking our advice as in finding ways of meeting each other, revealing how difficult it was for gay people to lead a normal social life. The Student Advisory Center began to take up more time than Student Magazine. I would be talking to possible suicides for an hour at 3 in the morning, advising pregnant girls as to who was the nicest doctor they could go and see, writing to someone who was terrified that he had caught venereal disease, but didn't dare tell his parents or go and see a doctor, and in what little time was left, trying to run the magazine. One of the biggest problems we found ourselves dealing with was that teenagers were unable to confide in their parents. Hearing other stories made me realize how lucky I was in my relationship with my own parents. They had never judged me, and always supported me, always praised the good things rather than criticized the bad things. I had no qualms about admitting my problems, worries, and failures. Our work was to try to help out those who were in trouble, but with nowhere to turn. With both the Student Advisory Center and Student Magazine, life at Albion Street remained frantic, and the numbers of people coming in and out of the house at all times of day and night continued to drive our neighbors to distraction. Due to complaints from the neighbors, we were visited on a regular basis by the church commissioner inspectors to check that we were not carrying out any kind of business. These visits had all the clockwork tension of a West End farce. The commissioners had to give us 24 hours notice before an inspection, and as soon as we received it, the whole student staff and my mum immediately wheeled into action. All the telephones were piled into a cupboard, and the desks and chairs and mattresses were covered by dust sheets. The student staff would pull out paint pots and paintbrushes, put on overalls, and start painting the walls of the house. Mum would arrive from the country with Lindy, 8-year-old Vanessa, and an armful of toys. By the time the church commissioners arrived, they would find a friendly crew of painters cheerfully decorating the house, the furniture all swathed in dust sheets, while a mother and her family huddled upstairs. The little girl would be playing with some toys in a rather bemused way, while Lindy and I were engrossed in Monopoly. If Vanessa ever looked as if she might ask us what was going on, Mum would rapidly shoo everyone out of the room, saying it was time for Vanessa's bed. The church inspectors would look at this happy domestic scene and wonder what all the fuss was about. They would scratch their heads and say what a lovely girl little Vanessa was, drink their tea, and have a nice chat with my mum. As soon as they had disappeared down the street, Mum went back home. We put away the Monopoly, yanked off the dust sheets, plugged in the telephones, and got back to work. The end came on one fatal visit, when we forgot to unplug the telephones. By then it was their 5th visit, and the inspectors must have suspected something. They stayed for their ritual cup of tea, and were just about to leave when 2 of the telephones started ringing inside the cupboard. A shocked silence fell. "And just listen to that," I improvised quickly. "Can you hear that telephone? The walls are so thin in these houses we can hear everything that goes on next door." The inspector strode forward and pulled open the cupboard door. 5 telephones, a switchboard, and a tangle of wires all tumbled out on top of him. Not even a big family needed a switchboard. That was the end of 44 Albion Street. Vanessa and her collection of dolls and toys were taken down to Shamley Green for the last time, and Lindy and I packed up the Monopoly set. Student magazine had to find somewhere else to use as an office. We scoured the neighborhood looking for somewhere to rent. The best deal was offered by the Reverend Cuthbert Scott. He liked the work of the advisory center and offered us the use of the crypt at St. John's Church, just off the Bayswater Road, for no rent at all. I put an old slab of marble across 2 tombs to make my desk, and everyone found themselves somewhere to sit. We even charmed the local post office engineer into connecting the telephone, without our having to wait the normal 3 months. After a while, none of us noticed that we were working in the dim light of the crypt surrounded by marble effigies and tombs. In November 1969, I received a visit from 2 plainclothes policemen from Marylebone Police Station. They had come to draw my attention to the 1889 Indecent Advertisements Act and the 1917 Venereal Disease Act, in case I was unaware of them, which, not surprisingly, I was. They told me that it was illegal to advertise any help or remedy for venereal disease. These acts had originally been introduced to stop quack doctors from exploiting the large numbers of people who came to them for expensive and ineffective cures for venereal disease. I argued that I was only offering a counseling service, and that I passed on anyone who had VD to qualified doctors at St. Mary's Hospital. But the policemen were adamant. If the Student Advisory Center continued to mention the words venereal disease in public, I would be arrested with the prospect of 2 years' imprisonment. The week before, we had successfully prosecuted a policeman from Marylebone Police Station for planting drugs on one of the Student Advisory Center's clients. The policeman had been sent down, and so I suspected that this visit was connected. I was amazed that the police had trawled through this old legislation to find some obscure law that we were breaking. We duly changed the mention of venereal disease in the leaflets we distributed around London and started describing it as social disease. Then we got a huge number of inquiries from people who were suffering from acne, and the number of people calling us for help over VD dropped from 60 a week to 10. We decided that the police were bluffing and that helping the remaining 50 people a week was worth risking the Metropolitan Police's threats. We reinserted the mention of VD. We were wrong. The police came back to the crypt again in December 1969 and arrested me. John Mortimer, a barrister who had established a reputation for his support of libertarian causes after his defense of Oz magazine and his role in the Lady Chatterley's Lover trial, offered to defend me. He agreed that the law was ridiculous and that the police were merely being vindictive. John reminded us that every public lavatory carried a government notice on the inside of the door, offering advice to those suffering from venereal disease. If I was guilty, then so was the government. I was duly prosecuted on 2 counts. Under the Indecent Advertisements Act 1889, which prohibited advertisements of an indecent or obscene nature, and deemed references to syphilis and gonorrhea to be indecent, and the Venereal Disease Act 1917, which banned advertisements offering treatment or advice, or mentioning the words venereal disease. At the first hearing on May 8, 1970 at the Marylebone Magistrates Court, Tom Dryburgh, the flamboyant Labour MP until 1974, gave a dramatic plea on my behalf. Chad Vara, the founder of the Samaritans, also gave evidence pointing out how many people the Student Advisory Center had referred to his charity. John Mortimer made his argument that, if I was found guilty, I would have no option but to prosecute the government and all the local authorities, since they had also put up notices in public lavatories. The magistrate dismissed the charge under the Venereal Disease Act on the grounds that the Student Advisory Center did not offer to cure people, but referred them to qualified doctors. He adjourned the other charge until May 22. As the court case was proceeding, statistics were released revealing that the number of people with venereal disease had risen dramatically in the previous year to a post-war peak. Lady Birk, the chairman of the Health Education Council, used the statistics together with the example of my prosecution to try to amend the 1889 Indecent Advertisements Act in the House of Lords. It's ludicrous that outmoded laws should restrict responsible efforts to stop the spread of these serious diseases, she said. By the time of the second court case, a number of newspapers had declared how idiotic it was that I was being prosecuted. There was a strong movement to change the law. The magistrate reluctantly found me guilty under the strict letter of the law, but he made it clear that he considered the law was absurd by fining me just £7, some way short of the 2 years imprisonment with which the police had been threatening me. John Mortimer made a statement to the press outside the court in which he called for the law to be changed, or we would have no alternative but to prosecute the government for mentioning VD on the doors of public lavatories. The newspapers all joined forces behind us, and Lady Birk's amendment to the law was incorporated into government legislation at the next sitting of Parliament. Reginald Maudling, the Home Secretary, sent me a personal letter apologizing for the Crown prosecution. That court case taught me that although I was young, wore jeans, and had very little money behind me, I need not be afraid of being bullied by the police or the establishment, particularly if I had a good barrister. One day in 1970 I came back to my desk, and found that Nick had been sitting at it. By mistake, he had left a draft of a memo, which he was writing to the staff. It was a plan to get rid of me as publisher and editor, take editorial and financial control of Student, and turn it into a cooperative. I would become just part of the team, and everyone would share equally in the editorial direction of the magazine. I was shocked. I felt that Nick, my closest friend, was betraying me. After all, Student had been my and Johnny's idea. We had started it at Stowe, and against all odds we had managed to publish it. I knew what I wanted to do with Student, and it seemed to me that everyone was happy working there. We all drew equal salaries, but ultimately I was the editor and publisher, and it was up to me to make the decisions. I looked around at everyone working. They all had their heads bent down studiously over their desks. I wondered how many were part of this. I put the memo in my pocket. When Nick came back, I stood up. "Nick," I said, "will you come outside for a quick chat?" I decided to bluff my way through the crisis. If Nick had already whipped up support from the 10 other people, it would be difficult for me to stop them. But if they were undecided, I could drive a wedge between Nick and the rest of them and cut Nick out. I had to put our friendship to one side and get rid of this challenge. "Nick," I said, as we walked down the street, "a number of people have come up to me and said that they're unhappy with what you're planning. They don't like the idea, but they're too scared to tell you to your face." Nick looked horrified. "I don't think that it's a good idea for you to stay here," I went on. "You're trying to undermine me and the whole of Student. I think that we should remain friends, but I don't think you should stay here anymore." I still don't know how I managed to say those words without blushing or my voice cracking. Nick looked down at his feet. "I'm sorry, Ricky," he said. "It just seemed a better way to organize ourselves." He trailed off. "I'm sorry too, Nick." I folded my arms and looked straight at him. "Let's see each other down in Shamley Green, but Student is my life." Nick left that day. I told everyone that Nick and I had disagreed over how to run Student, and they were free to leave or to carry on, whatever they wished. They all decided to stay with me, and life at the crypt went on without Nick. This was the first real disagreement I ever had. Although I felt anguished, I knew I had to confront it. I hate criticizing people who work with me, and I try to avoid doing so. Ever since then, I have always tried to avoid the issue by asking someone else to wield the axe. I admit that this is a weakness, but I am simply unable to cope with it. Nick was my best friend, and I deeply hoped that he would remain so. When I was next down in Shamley Green, the first went round to see Nick, and found him eating one of his mum's puddings. We sat down together and polished it off. Apart from the fact that he was my oldest friend, Nick had taken charge of the distribution of the magazine and made sense of it. I missed him terribly. Until Nick had arrived, the distribution had only ever been casually handled, with bundles being sent out to volunteers in schools and universities. For over a year, Student carried on without Nick, and we put out 4 more editions. When Nick told me that he was standing for a student election at Sussex University, I used Student's purchasing power with the printers to run off some cheap campaign posters. Nick won the election, but was later disqualified because he had got outside support for his campaign. One thing I knew from everyone who came in to chat or work for us was that they spent a good deal of time listening to music and a good deal of money buying records. We had the record player on constantly, and everyone rushed out to buy the latest Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, or Jefferson Airplane album the day it was released. There was tremendous excitement about music. It was political. It was anarchic. It summed up the young generation's dream of changing the world. And I also noticed that people who would never dream of spending as much as 40 shillings on a meal wouldn't hesitate to spend 40 shillings buying the latest Bob Dylan album. The more obscure the albums were, the more they cost, and the more they were treasured. Up to this point, I had been interested in making money, only to ensure students' continuing success, and to fund the Student Advisory Center. But it struck me as a very interesting business opportunity. When I heard that, despite the government's abolition of the retail price maintenance agreement, none of the shops were offering discounted records, I began to think about setting up a record distribution business. The number of people working on Student had grown to around 20, and we all still lived together in 44 Albion Street and worked in the crypt. I thought about the high cost of records and the sort of people who bought Student magazine, and wondered whether we could advertise and sell cheap mail-order records through the magazine. As it turned out, the first advertisement for mail-order records appeared in the final edition of Student. Without Nick to manage Student's distribution, it was floundering, but the offer of cheap records brought in a flood of inquiries and more cash than we had ever seen before. We decided to come up with another name for the mail-order business, a name that would be eye-catching, that could stand alone and not appeal just to students. We sat around in the church crypt trying to choose a good one. Slip disc was one of the favorite suggestions. We toyed with it for a while, until one of the girls leant forward. "I know," she said. "What about virgin? We're complete virgins at business. And there aren't many virgins left around here," laughed one of the other girls. "It would be nice to have one here in name if nothing else." "Great," I decided on the spot. "It's virgin."
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.